Okay, so as we described before, while I'm pulling up where we are right now, we are going through the Backbone 101 course of the year one material, and in it we are looking at 8 different sections of philosophy with live debates in them that have, enduring questions that have been around for a long time. These each of these sections counts as sort of a 101 intro to other courses which attenuate the first year material. So we have a philosophy of mind course coming up where we get to go more in depth into all sorts of aspects of philosophy of mind. But in this part, we only do the mind body question, a few questions about identity and immortality and things like that, but mostly the mind body question. On Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, which is today, we are doing the 101 intro to the ethics. So we're still following along in this book, and we're focusing mostly on the question of subjectivity or objectivity of moral values and moral statements and moral judgments. And that's where we're going to pick up today. But there's an ethics course. We did the philosophy of God, like the existence of God section, which there's a class that's going to be starting at some point that is philosophy of theology. So let's see. The indefinability of good. We finished that essay. And critique of ethics by Ayer. I feel like we did that. Okay, so here we are. The new subjectivism in ethics. That's where we left off. Am I right, Savad? Chapter 29 by Brand Blanchard. Yeah. Okay, good. In that case, let's get into it. By the new subjectivism in ethics, I mean the view that when anyone says this is right or this is good, he is only expressing his own feeling. He is not asserting anything true or false because he is not asserting or judging at all. He is really making an exclamation that expresses a favorable feeling. This view has recently come into much favor, with variations of detail. It is being advocated by Russell, Wittgenstein, and Ayer in England, and by Carnap, Stevenson, Fiegel, and others in this country. Why is it that the theory has come into so rapid a popularity? Is it because moralists of insight have been making a fresh and searching examination of moral experience and its expression? No, I think not. A consideration of the names just mentioned suggests a truer reason. All these names belong, roughly speaking, to a single school of thought in the theory of knowledge. In the new view, if the new view has become popular in ethics, it is because certain persons who were at work in the history of knowledge arrived at a new view there and found, on thinking it out, that it required the new view in ethics. The view comes less from ethical analysis than from logical positivism. Okay, there's a term. Let me just try to turn this other light on so I can read a little more easily. Shoot. Okay. So we'll discuss logical positivism here. As positivists, these writers held that every judgment belongs to one or other of two types. On the one hand, it may be a priori or necessary, but then it is always analytic, i.e., it unpacks in its predicate part or all of its subject. Can we safely say that 7 and 5 make 12? Yes, because 12 is what we mean by 7 and 5. On the other hand, the judgment may be empirical, and then, if we are to verify it, we can no longer look to our meanings only. It refers to sense experience, and there we must look for its warrant. Having arrived at this division of judgments, the positivists raised the question where value judgments fall. The judgment that knowledge is good, for example, did not seem to be analytic. The value that knowledge might have did not seem to be part of our concept of knowledge. But neither was the statement empirical, for goodness was not a quality like red or squeaky that could be seen or heard. What were they to do then with these awkward judgments of value? To find a place for them in their theory of knowledge would require them to revise the theory radically, and yet that theory was what they regarded as their most important discovery. It appeared that the theory could be saved in only one way: if it could be shown that judgments of good and bad were not judgments at all, that they asserted nothing true or false, but merely expressed emotions like hurrah or fiddlesticks. Then these wayward judgments would cease from troubling the weary heads, and weary heads could be at rest. This is the course the positivists took. They explained value judgments by explaining them away. Okay, so I think he might be right here, but the first thing we'll notice is that he's giving a story about why it is that the emotivists have come into prominence, and we're going to do a whole section on what a priori means, and we're going to examine the qualities of certain types of statements. But he's saying that these logical positivists, they said all statements are either analytic or they are something amenable to empirical investigation. So all bachelors are unmarried men. That's true, but you don't have to go and examine the world. It's true by the definitions. That's what we mean by unmarried man is bachelor, and that's what we mean by bachelor is an unmarried man. And so it just has to be true in a sense. So it's true a priori, which just means before investigation. Well, doesn't just it. It can be taken to mean just before investigation. On the other hand, the other set of categories are things that are about the world that you would have to go and investigate things in order to, see if it turns out to be true or not true. And he says the problem is that, we've read an essay where somebody said goodness is like yellowness. It's something that you have like vision, you have a faculty to understand, and that's what underpins and is the basis for ethics. But it's not so obvious to this logical positivist that we have any way of measuring, right? We can't just measure it. It's just sort of people's subjective report that they like or don't like something. And so, or that they have a sense that it's good or not good or in the right direction or destructive or whatever. And so since it wasn't something that they could settle scientifically, they had a problem, he says. They couldn't put it into the first category where it was analytically true. And we saw an essay about why that would or wouldn't work earlier. And then he says, and they couldn't put it in the category of things that are actually about the world because then nothing was amenable to science there. And they have this perspective. He says that's the only reason why it got popular, because it didn't get popular from people really thinking about how we use the words good and bad and what our ethical conversation is like. It's not like we dove into ethics to try to figure this out and then it emerged, he's saying. He's saying instead, we had these logical positivists with their two categories of types of statements to consider, and these statements didn't seem to fit neatly into either one, and so they had to decide that they just weren't statements. And we read an essay on emotivism last time or the time before, so we know what they're saying there. All right. Now, I do not think their view will do, he says. But before discussing it, I should like to record one vote of thanks to them for the clarity with which they have stated their case. It has been said of John Stuart Mill that he wrote so clearly that he could be found out. This theory has been put so clearly and precisely that it deserves criticism of the same kind, and this I will do my best to supply. The theory claims to show, by analysis, that when we say that is good, we do not mean to assert a character of the subject of which we are thinking. I shall argue that we do mean to do just that. Okay, so now he's going to say, look, let's go and actually examine the way we use the words, what the words mean to us, and see if we can so easily just wish away the idea that these are statements about the world. And that is good. Okay, and we also will keep in mind that the emotivists are not saying, if I say murder is bad, what I'm saying is it's true that murder is bad and I don't like it. It's also not true that all I'm saying is I don't like murder. I'm not even saying that, right? Because the emotivist position is that I'm making no claim that could be true or false. And the claim I don't like murder could be true or false. And you could investigate to try to find out. Instead, what it boils down to for the emotivist is I'm just identifying murder as a concept and going, that thing, I'm like actually acting out an emotional response when I say it's bad. I'm doing nothing more than that. That's the emotivist position. And what that means is that I'm not actually claiming anything that could be true or false. Blanchard is going to say, let's just look at how we use the words and let's see if that really holds up. If we could possibly make sense of all the ways in which we talk about these things and say, could it really be that all we're doing is growling or cheering or booing or something? Okay. Let us work through an example, and the simpler and commoner, the better. There is perhaps no value statement on which people would more universally agree than the statement that intense pain is bad. Let us take a set of circumstances in which I happen to be interested on the legislative side and in which I think every one of us might naturally make such a statement. We come upon a rabbit that has been caught in one of the brutal traps in common use. There are signs that it has struggled for days to escape, and that in a frenzy of hunger, pain, and fear, it has all but eaten off its own leg. The attempt failed. The animal is now dead. As we think of the long and excruciating pain it must have suffered, we are very likely to say it was a bad thing that the little animal should suffer so. The positivist tells us that when we say this, we are only expressing our present emotion. Right? The only facts we're saying there are that animal suffered a lot, but we're saying it with oh, can you believe it? That animal suffered a lot, right? I hold on the contrary that we mean to assert something of the pain itself. We're talking about the pain, namely that it was bad when and as it occurred. Consider what follows from the positivist view. On that view, nothing good or bad happened in the case until I came on the scene and made my remark. For what I express in my remark is something going on in me at the time, and that, of course, did not exist until I did come on the scene. The pain of the rabbit was not itself bad. Nothing evil was happening when that pain was being endured. Badness, in the only sense in which it is involved at all, waited for its appearance until I came and looked and felt. Now that this is at odds with our meaning, may be shown as follows. Let us put to ourselves the hypothesis that we had not come on the scene and that the rabbit never was discovered. Are we prepared to say that in that case, nothing bad occurred in the sense in which we said it did?
May I ask something?
Please.
Did he just say that, contrary to Hume, he acknowledges and I that the impression is waiting for the eye to acknowledge it? The impression is always there, but it's waiting to be to have its appearance. That's how I concluded to that. It's waiting for
Yeah.
an eye to verify it that it is there.
Um Hold on, let me think. He's saying something so it's not necessary that we agree with Hume's idea of identity for this to be the case, but as far as the ethical quality goes, yeah, in a sense, right? He's saying the badness of the event in the past magically manifested itself when the perception by the valuing creature was made, right? And he's saying that's the logical consequence of these logical positivists is that when I say it was bad that the animal had suffered so, I'm not really saying anything about what happened. It didn't happen that way until I looked at it. So he thinks that's wrong, and he's going to be able to show why that's wrong. But there's certainly so we don't know his argument yet. I'll just say that there certainly are people who will take what he's suggested right there and swallow it whole and say, yeah, no problem, no problem. Valuing creatures have to show up for there to be values of things. And if a tree falls in the middle of the woods when no one's around, it doesn't make a sound. And if a rabbit dies a horrible, slow death, it's not horrible unless somebody knows about it, who can judge it to be horrible, something like that. But he thinks we can look at what we're saying, and we'll see what his argument is here to say that no such system like that could actually make sense of what we're saying. So let us put to ourselves the hypothesis that we had not come on the scene and that the rabbit had never been discovered. Are we prepared to say that in that case, nothing bad occurred in the sense in which we said it did? Clearly not. Indeed, we should say, on the contrary, that the accident of our later discovery made no difference whatever to the badness of the animal's pain. That it would have been every whit as bad whether a chance passerby happened later to discover the body and feel repugnance or not. If so, then it is clear that in saying the suffering was bad, we are not expressing our feelings only. We are saying that the pain was bad when and as it occurred and before anyone took any attitude toward it. Okay, let's be careful here. His position isn't that that proves anything except that that's not the way we use the words, right? The statement, what the emotivists are saying, that the statement only is like an exclamation mark on a regular statement, can't be correct, because you could come around and say, had no one been here, my showing up doesn't mean anything. It doesn't make the badness worse or less. I'm claiming something, even if he's wrong, right? Even if David Hume's perspective is correct or something like that, it doesn't matter. He says, let's just look at what the words are meant to mean to decide whether or not the words can really be translated to mean just this thing like an exclamation mark. Okay, that's cool. The first argument is thus an ideal experiment in which we use the method of difference. It removes our present expression and shows that the badness we meant would not be affected by this, whereas on positivist grounds, it should be. The second argument applies the method in the reverse way. It ideally removes the past event and shows that this would render false what we mean to say. Whereas on positivist grounds, it should not. Let us suppose that the animal did not in fact fall into the trap and did not suffer at all, but that we mistakenly believe it did, and say, as before, that its suffering was an evil thing. On the positivist theory, everything I sought to express by calling it evil in the first case is still present in the second, in the only sense in which badness is involved at all. Whatever was bad in the first case is still present in its entirety, since all that is expressed is in either case is a state of feeling, and that feeling is still there. And our question is such an implication consistent with what we meant? Clearly it is not. If anyone asked us, after we made the remark that the suffering was a bad thing, whether we should think it was relevant to what we said to learn that the incident had never occurred at all and no pain had been suffered at all, we should say that it made all the difference in the world, that what we were asserting to be bad was precisely the suffering we thought had occurred back there, that if this had not occurred, there was nothing left to be bad, and that our assertion was in that case mistaken. The suggestion that in saying something evil had occurred, we were, after all, making no mistake, because we had never meant anyhow to say anything about the past suffering, seems to me merely frivolous. If we did not mean to say this, why should we be so relieved on finding that the suffering had not occurred? On the theory before us, okay, that's an interesting argument. So he says, look, you say, oh, isn't it bad that that rabbit had such a long and painful and slow death? That's such a bad thing that it should suffer so. And then somebody comes along and says, you know what? It's going to sound crazy, but this rabbit had a great life and he died of natural causes. And then somebody put him here in the trap to make it look like he had suffered along because it's a part of a play or a trick or something that he was doing for some completely different purpose. You were never meant to discover it. It was about something else. And he was there to take a photograph of it for some reason or whatever. And so the animal didn't suffer at all. It had a great life. And however it died, it didn't die in the way that you imagine it did. And then he says, okay, if the logical positivist view is correct, nothing has changed about my original statement. There was no badness anyway. It was just an emotive feeling. And so there shouldn't be a change in my, what should we say? I'm quite relieved to find out that I was wrong about what happened in the past. But what happened in the past is relevant to to the thing I was expressing. If if you say, "Ooh, I felt bad when I thought it had suffered, and now I don't feel so bad," that doesn't that doesn't really change it, right? Like you could imagine somebody who says, "Okay, I look at the scene and I think, oh, that rabbit suffered so. That's so terrible." And you say, "Oh, well, here, take this pill. You'll feel better." "Oh, okay, I'll take the pill. I feel totally better. It's a pill that magically takes away my concern for the suffering of rabbits. And now I feel better." And logically, I still say to you, it's still a horrible thing that that animal suffered. I don't have so much, I don't want to cry like I did before. But gosh, don't you agree that animals shouldn't be forced to suffer like that? That seems wrong, right? If it's just an expression of feeling, um, how come it can change in both of those other ways that he mentioned? Okay. On the theory before us, such relief would be groundless, for in that suffering itself, there was nothing bad at all, and hence, in its non occurrence, there would be nothing to be relieved about. The positivist theory would here distort our meaning beyond recognition. Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on. So before we go on, is anybody unconvinced by his argument so far? We might need a really good argument against emotivism, but is he making a sufficiently good one? I'm not sure. So far as I can see, interrupt anytime. So far as I can see, there's only one way out for the positivist. He holds that goodness and badness lie in feelings of approval or disapproval, and there is a way in which he might hold that badness did, in this case, precede our own feeling of disapproval without belonging to the pain itself. The pain in itself was neutral, but unfortunately, the rabbit, on no grounds at all, took up towards this neutral object an attitude of disapproval, and that made it, for the first time, and in the only intelligible sense, bad. This way of escape is theoretically possible, but since it has grave difficulties of its own and has not, so far as I know, been urged by positivists, it is perhaps best not to spend time over it. So we could look at that again. He's saying, look, I think the positivists could still hold their view if only they'll say there was nothing bad about the pain, but the rabbit himself was feeling disapproval when it was happening. Is that what he's getting at? Yeah. Okay. But he says no one's made that argument. He thinks that's the only way out of what he's said so far. I'm not sure it is. I come now to a third argument, which again is very simple. When we come upon the rabbit and make our remark about its suffering being a bad thing, we presumably make it with some feeling. The positivists are plainly right in saying that such remarks do usually express feeling. But suppose that a week later we revert to the incident in thought and make our statement again. And suppose that the circumstances have now so changed that the feeling with which we made the remark in the first place has faded. The pathetic evidence is no longer before us. Pathetic meaning passion, right? Pathos. So the evidence of the passion. And we are now so fatigued in body and mind that feeling is, as we say, quite dead. In these circumstances, since what was expressed by the remark when first made is, on the theory before us, simply absent, the remark now expresses nothing. It is as empty as the word hurrah would be if it was uttered with no enthusiasm behind it. And this seems to me untrue. When we repeat the mark that such suffering was a bad thing, the feeling with which we made it last week may be at or near the vanishing point. But if we were asked whether we meant to say what we did before, we should certainly answer yes. Okay, so that's an interesting analysis. He's saying, let's look at the way we're using these words. I could say something is bad in a moment of great passion. I could say it when I'm distracted by other things, and and you just interrupt me and say, "Hey, is that thing bad?" "Oh yeah, that's a bad thing." And I could say it when I have almost no feeling at all about anything, and I could still make the statement. And then if you said to me, now the 3 times you made those statements, were those different statements? Was it more bad the first time? Are you really want to assert that it was bad when you were feeling passionate? And then when you were really disinterested or distracted, you were saying, yeah, I mean, it's bad, but like a little bit, it's a little bit bad. He goes, no, if you asked me, I would say when I said it was bad the third time, I meant the exact same thing I meant the first time, right? I can do it logically and reasonably, and I can just make the pronouncement of the judgment. So he's not saying just that you can say it without feeling. He's saying that if you're asked, do you mean something different when your feelings are at a different pitch? You say, no, I mean exactly the same thing I meant before. And if I then, show you the rabbit again and your feelings rise up again, you say, see, yeah, that's such a bad thing. Oh, you're feeling it again. Is it more bad now? No, I mean exactly what I said 2 seconds ago when you hadn't reminded me of just how bad it was by looking at it. But yeah, I meant the same thing. So he's just looking at the way the words are used, and he thinks nobody can agree that this is all the words are used to do, is to just express emotion. When we repeat the remark that such suffering was a bad thing, the feeling with which we made it last week may be near the vanishing point. But when we are asked whether we meant to say what we did before, we should certainly answer yes. We should say that we made our point with feeling the first time and little or no feeling the second time, but that it was the same point we were making, right? So there's a point that's being made in the words. They're not just emotion. And if we can see that what we meant to say remains the same while the feeling varies from intensity to near zero, it is not the feeling that we primarily meant to express. I now come to a fourth consideration. We all believe that toward acts or effects of a certain kind, one attitude is fitting and another not. But on the theory before us, such a belief would not make sense. Broad and Ross have lately contended that this fitness is one of the main facts of ethics, and I suspect that they are right. But that is not exactly my point. My point is this: whether there is such fitness or not, we all assume that there is. And if we do, we express in moral judgments more than the subjectivists say we do. Let me illustrate. In his novel, The House of the Dead, Dostoevsky tells of his experience in a Siberian prison camp. Whatever the unhappy inmates of such camps are like today, Dostoevsky's companions were about as grim a lot as can be imagined. I have heard stories, he writes, of the most terrible, the most unnatural actions, of the most monstrous murders, told with the most spontaneous, childishly merry laughter. Unquote. Most of us would say that in this delight at the killing of others or the causing of suffering, there is something very unfitting. If we were asked why we thought so, we should say that these things involved great evil and are wrong, and that to take delight in what is evil or wrong is plainly unfitting. We see where he's going with this. This is kind of an interesting argument, right? Now, on the subjectivist view, this answer is ruled out. For before someone takes up an attitude towards death, suffering, or their infliction, they have no moral quality at all. There is therefore nothing about them to which an attitude of approval or condemnation could be fitting. They are in themselves neutral, and so far as they get a moral quality, they get it only through being invested with it by the attitude of the onlooker. But if that is true, why is any attitude more fitting than any other? Would applause, for example, be fitting if, apart from the applause, there was nothing good to applaud? Would condemnation be fitting if, independently of the condemnation, there was nothing bad to condemn? In such a case, any attitude would be as fitting or unfitting as any other, which means that the notion of fitness has lost all point. Indeed, we are forced to go much further. If goodness and badness lie in attitudes only and hence are brought into being by them, those men who greeted death and misery with childishly merry laughter are taking the only sensible line. If there is nothing evil in the things, if they get their moral complexion only from our feeling about them, why shouldn't they be greeted with a cheer? To greet them with repulsion would turn what before was neutral into something bad. It would needlessly bring badness into the world. And even on subjectivist assumptions, that does not seem very bright. On the other hand, to greet them with delight would convert what before was neutral into something good. It would bring goodness into the world. If I have murdered a man and wish to remove the stain, the way is clear. It is to cry, hurrah for the murder. What is the subjectivist to reply? I can only guess. He may point out, so that's really interesting. Let's pause at that last two paragraphs, that last argument. And then, well, the last paragraph where he took it even further. If the answer to the original criticisms is to double down and say emotivism is true, there is no goodness or badness except that valuing creatures have feelings and they express their feelings from time to time. The only goodness or badness is that the word bad or good means nothing more than boo or hooray. And that's not saying something true or false about anything else. It's just having an emotive response. If that's all badness is your emotive response, then you should never condemn anything, because that would be bringing badness into the world. He's holding their feet to the fire on that. He's saying the consequence of that is that you should cheer for everything, lest you be the bringer of badness into being. Does anybody want to raise their hand and say, yeah, that's exactly what I think we've all been talking about this whole time we've been discussing how we should live and what the consequences are of certain actions? Nobody thinks that's what the words could possibly mean, right? So he says, what would the subjectivist reply to this? I can only guess. He may point out that the inflicting of death is not really neutral before the onlooker takes his attitude, for the man who inflicted the death no doubt himself took an attitude, and thus the act had a moral quality derived from this. But that makes the case more incredible still, for the man who did the act presumably approved it. I don't know if that's presumably, but okay. And if so, it was good. It certainly could have happened that way. And if so, it was good in the only sense in which anything is good. And then our conviction that the laughter is unfit is more unaccountable still. It may be replied that the victim, too, had his attitude, and that since this was unfavorable, the act was not unqualifiedly good. But the answer is plain. Let the killer be expert at his job. Let him dispatch his victim instantly before he has time to take an attitude, and then gloat about his perfect crime without ever telling anyone. Then, so far as I can see, his act will be good without any qualification. It would become bad only if someone found out about it and disliked it. That would be a curiously irrational procedure, since the man's approving of his own killing is in itself as neutral as the killing that it approves. Why then should anyone dislike it? So he's making 2 points at the same time, I think. Maybe I'm missing it, but this other point is kind of interesting. It's like we not only say I disapprove of murder, and you know why? Because it's bad, right? And I'm saying it is actually bad. Not only do we do that, but if all that is having a feeling about something, how is it that I can sometimes say it's bad to not regret your sins? It's bad to it's even worse to commit a murder and be happy about it. Well, wait a minute. Being happy about the murder you committed is bad. All I'm bringing to the table is me saying I don't like something. Well, no, not even saying that. It's just me going, how can I go about somebody else's yay or right? Does it make any sense? Like maybe it does, but it certainly doesn't seem to be what we're talking about, right? It may be replied that we can defend our dislike on this ground that if the approval of killing were to go unchecked and spread, most men would have to live in insecurity and fear, and these things are undesirable. But surely this reply is not open. These things are not, on the theory, undesirable, for nothing is. In themselves, they are neutral. Right? He's saying, what you're saying is there's no good or bad in things themselves. Okay, let's stick to that. There's nothing good or bad in things themselves. There's just people have emotive responses to certain ideas. Why then should I disapprove men's living in this state? The answer may come that if other men live in insecurity and fear, I shall in time be infected myself. But even in my own insecurity and fear, there is, on the theory before us, nothing bad whatever. And therefore, if I disapprove of them, it is without a shadow of ground and with no more fitness in my attitude than if I cordially cheered them. The theory thus conflicts with our judgments of fitness all along the line. I think he's saying that the consequence of this emotive theory is that we can have a perfect ethical world if we all just decide to cheer everything we see. No longer be concerned with right and wrong, just be concerned with calling everything right, and then there's no more wrong anymore because it's just you feeling a certain way. I come now to a fifth and final difficulty with the theory. It makes mistakes about values. It makes mistakes about values impossible. There's a whole nest of interconnected criticisms here, some of which have been made so often that I shall not develop them again, such as that I can never agree or disagree in opinion with anyone else about an ethical matter, and that in these matters I can never be consistent with others or with myself. I am not at all content with the sort of analysis which says that the only contradictions in such cases have regard to facts and that contradictions about values are only differences of feeling. I think that if anyone tells me that having a bicuspid out without anesthetic is not a bad experience, and I say it is a very nasty experience indeed, I am differing with him in opinion and differing about the degrees of badness of the experience. But without pressing this further, let me apply the argument in what is perhaps a fresh direction. Okay, so we're familiar with that argument because the original emotivist case that we read was trying to make it an account for this potential problem. So he's going to go further now and say, there's an old and merciful distinction that moralists have made for many centuries about conduct. The distinction between what is subjectively and what is objectively right. They have said that in any given situation, there is some act which, in view of all the circumstances, would be the best act to do. And this is what would be objectively right. The notion of an objectively right act is the ground of our notion of duty. Our duty is always to find and to do this act if we can. But of course, we often don't find it. We often hit upon and do acts that we think are the right ones, but we are mistaken. And then our act is only subjectively right. Between these two acts, the disparity may be continual. Professor Pritchard suggests that probably few of us in the course of our lives ever succeed in doing the right act. Now, so far as I can see, the new subjectivism would abolish this difference at a stroke. Okay, so he's saying this is something else we're going to lose. Something we've been talking about for a long time that clearly means something to us within the field of ethics. We're going to lose the access to talking about this at all, which is this. I can't be wrong. If I am trying really hard to find the best thing to do and I'm wrong, and I do the thing that I think is the best thing, but it's not the best thing to do, how does that make sense if all I'm doing is emoting? When I say it's the best thing to do, if I think it's the best thing to do, it is the best thing to do by definition, because all I meant by the best thing to do is I feel really great about this. And I would feel really great about it if I thought it was the best thing to do. That's all it could mean if emotivism is true. And so he says, the idea that you could be mistaken, right? And this was brought up in the original argument for the emotivism. They tried to answer this, but he thinks it's not really, it's not really answerable. We're going to lose, like, just like when I agreed with myself that the suffering of the rabbit was wrong, I may think I'm doing something good in one moment and then later reflect upon it and say, oh, I made a big mistake. I made a big mistake back then. Why should I say that? If I remember thinking it was good at the time, why should I not feel good about it now? And how could I, so this is really the part, because obviously you could change your mind. The original argument said, well, obviously you could change your mind. You could feel good about it then and feel bad about it now. But what he's saying is, no, I was wrong when I felt good about it. How could you be wrong? It's just a fact that you felt good about it, and it's a fact that you now feel differently about it, right? What do the words mean? I was wrong to simply have a feeling. Is it true that you had the feeling? Yes. Does the feeling mean anything about anything in the world beyond that? No, says the emotivist. So how can it be wrong? How can that idea even be a thing somebody can think? Well, obviously, because when we say something is right or wrong, we don't just mean nothing, and we aren't just emoting. Now, so far as I can see, the new subjectivism would abolish this difference at a stroke. Let us take a case. A boy abuses his small brother. We should commonly say, that is wrong, but perhaps he doesn't know any better. By reason of bad teaching and a feeble imagination, he may see nothing wrong in what he is doing and may even be proud of it. If so, his act may be subjectively right to him, though it is miles away from what is objectively right. What concerns me about the new subjectivism is that it prohibits this distinction. How could you ever say something like that if emotivism is true? If the boy feels this way about his act, then it is right in the only sense in which anything could be right. It is true that he has the feeling he has. The notion of an objective right lying beyond what he has discovered and which he ought to seek and do is a meaningless conversation. There might, to be sure, be an act that would more generally arouse favorable feelings in others, but that would not make it right for him unless he thought of it and approved it, which he doesn't. Even if he did think of it, it would not be obligatory for him to feel about it in any particular way, since there is nothing in any act, as we have seen, which would make any feeling more suitable than any other. Now, if there is no such thing as an objectively right act, what becomes of the idea of duty? I have suggested that the idea of duty rests on the idea of such an act, since it is always our duty to find an act and do it if we can. To find that act and do it if we can. But did I miss a word in the previous sentence? I have suggested that the idea of duty rests on the idea of such an act. Of an objectively right act, or to find that act and do it. But if whatever we feel approval for at the time is the only way in which that thing could be right, what is the point of doubting and searching further? Like the little girl in Boston who was asked if she would like to travel, we can answer, why should I travel when I'm already there? If I am reconciled in feeling to my present act, no act I could discover by reflection could be better. Oh, okay. He's saying, look, how is it possible that a human being can think to himself, I wonder if I'm doing the right thing? If the only thing the right thing means is I feel a certain way about this thing, right? I could be doing something thinking this is the best thing to do, but there could be a niggling doubt in my mind that says, you felt that way before about something similar to this and you didn't like the outcome and this might not actually be the right thing. Are you so sure you got it right? What? Or I could say, I've always felt great about this act. Every time I've done this act, it feels awesome. I think it's the best act and the morally best act to do. But somebody made an argument to me that it's not the right way to act, and they could be right, I suppose. I mean, it didn't seem that way to me, but there's an argument in my head, and I'm wondering if I'm really doing the right thing. How can that mean anything? If the emotivists are correct, that idea shouldn't even be possible. The language should just, it's like a miracle is being spoken right now when somebody says, I felt great about this act, but I wondered if it was really the right thing to do. If the emotivists are correct, all you mean by the right thing to do is I feel great about this act. And you don't even mean that. You just are feeling great. So miracles are happening in ethics all the time. Analyze the way we're talking about it. If the emotivists are correct, there's miracle after miracle after miracle. We're having all sorts of conversations that shouldn't even be thinkable unless the emotivists are wrong and we're actually talking about something. I've suggested that
Does anybody else think this view is ridiculous?
The emotivist view, or the view that he is criticizing it?
Yeah, the emotivist view.
Yeah, well,
You're talking about, right? Like, ignorance isn't an excuse.
yeah, the emotivist would say that's how you feel. I get it. You felt you felt like you felt bad about people excusing things you don't like. Sure, I feel the same way. I agree in my feelings with you. Sure. But we're not talking about something we could investigate. We're not talking about something actually being bad. All you're doing is expressing how you feel. I don't like that either. I feel like it's bad too.
Right. If we just gave in to our pleasure and everything that felt good, it would just be a total disaster.
Yeah, it's funny that you can say that while chuckling. It's like you don't have a bad feeling and yet you're expressing that something is bad. Right? I mean, this is the way that this gentleman is trying to take apart the whole thing. He's trying to say, how are we using these words? Has anybody noticed that we're not emoting? We're certainly not just emoting. That there are things that are happening here that depend on the idea that we are talking about something, and that you can't just reduce what we're saying to a bunch of hissy fits. Right? That's the way he's thinking. And I I think he's doing a good job of making the emotivist view look ridiculous. I think that the essay arguing for emotivism, so I'll agree with you in the first part. I think the essay arguing for it wasn't stupid sounding. I mean, it wasn't like you would immediately see that it couldn't be the case. It made a strong case. But I think he's coming along and he's doing a good job of making us think, well, how stupid are we that we were taken by that essay? But, he's doing a good job of making it look ridiculous. I'll agree with you. And it's interesting. What we should pause and notice is the way he's doing it. And this is a very common thing. I don't mean it's like the only thing or even the main thing that philosophers do, but it is often the case, especially in meta conversations. This is a meta ethical consideration, right? We're not saying murder is bad or murder is good. We're saying, what do we mean when we say murder is bad or murder is good? It's very, very, very common in those conversations to draw conclusions. He's not just saying, well, it seems like we're talking about something, so we must be talking about something. No. He's saying we're using words that would be miracles to even conceptualize if what you're saying is true. If what you're saying is true, our use of language, the way we use it, is impossible. So therefore, what you're saying is not true. That's actually the case he's making, and he's doing it by analyzing the way we're talking about it, right? Nobody even has to have ever uttered a correct ethical statement in the history of the world. We could have all been wrong about everything we've ever said, and he could still make this argument. We were talking about something. There's 5 reasons here why you're going to lose the conversation, and also your right to say you've analyzed the conversation correctly. Right? It's not just that, well, now you can't talk about those things. Well, the emotivists are fine. They say, yeah, we were under an illusion and all of those things are not true. But what he's saying is, if what you're doing is analyzing what the way the words are being used, and you're saying they're not being used to make statements, they're just being used to say hurrah or boo, and that's it, then you can't make sense out of 9/10 of what people were saying, because it actually contradicts that in these various ways. And some of it is miraculous. Some of it couldn't have been thought. If the only thing saying the rabbit suffering was a bad thing is saying, it's not even saying I feel bad about it. It's just feeling bad about it. That's all that you're saying is the rabbit suffered, but you're saying it with a tear in your eye. If that's all you're doing, thinking about doing something better than the thing you think is the best thing to do is incomprehensible. It shouldn't be possible for a person to have that thought. But people do have those thoughts. Saying the child is doing what he thinks is best, but he's wrong, should be an impossible thought to have. But obviously we have that thought and we have those conversations, and we're right to do so because the emotivists are wrong. All right. It's a cool method he's using. It's a pretty short essay, so we'll pause if anybody else has anything else they want to say, and then we'll wrap it up. otherwise. I agree with you. I think he's doing a good job of making this look ridiculous. Okay. But if we have whatever we feel approval for at the time is right, then the point of what is the point of doubting and searching further? Okay, wait, we read all that. Da, da, da. It may be replied that by further reflection, I can find an act that would satisfy my feelings more widely than the present one, and that this is the act I should seek. But this reply means either that such general satisfaction is objectively better, which would contradict the theory, or else that if at the time I don't feel it better, it isn't better, in which case I have no motive for seeking it. When certain So this is very important, right? He could be saying a lot of other things. He's saying something really quite surgically specific. What he's saying is, all right, maybe the emotivist would say, well, you think you're doing the best thing, but you have a niggling doubt that maybe there was something that you would find even more pleasant. Wait, what? What? No. It shouldn't be possible that if I am under the subjective impression that I'm doing the thing that would be most approvaling of, that I would feel best about doing, there's no way that it's wrong, that it's the thing I would feel best about doing. Well, maybe something else would make you feel better. No, I judge this as the thing that would be the best thing to do, which according to you just means I would be most pleased if I did this thing. It can't possibly be that there's something else. And there's no reason for me to look for something else because I've already found it. And the idea that I could conceptualize as I'm doing the act that I clearly think is the best thing to do, I wonder if I'm wrong, if this is actually a bad thing to do. The fact that that's even thinkable is incomprehensible if all I mean is nothing that could be true or false, but just I'm having a feeling, but not even that, because that could be true or false. It's just the quality of having a feeling while I'm doing something. He thinks it's impossible, and so it makes nonsense of the whole view. When certain self-righteous persons took an inflexible line with Oliver Cromwell, that his very Cromwellian reply was, "Bethink ye, gentlemen, by the bowels of Christ, that ye may be mistaken." It was good advice. I hope nobody will take from me the privilege of finding myself mistaken. I should be sorry to think that the self of 30 years ago was so far along the path as the self of today, merely because he was a smug young jackanapes. Or even that the paragon of today has as little room for improvement as would be allowed by this myopic complacency. It matters to me that I don't know what's right and I'm trying to figure it out better. And that's impossible. It's impossible that could even be the case. If I think what I'm doing is right, that's what I do. I do what I think is right. According to the emotivist, that's the most right anything can be, because all you're doing is feeling a way about what you're doing. Don't you take that away from me. He says, you would take that away. It wouldn't be thinkable anymore if what you were saying is true, that I could actually want to know better what the right thing to do is. One final remark. The great problems of the day are international problems. Has the new subjectivism any bearing upon these problems? I think it has, and a somewhat sinister bearing. I would not suggest, of course, that those who hold the theory are one whit less public-spirited than others. Surely there are few who could call themselves citizens of the world with more right, if rights have meaning any longer, than Mr. Russell. But Mr. Russell has confessed himself discontented with his ethical theory, and in view of his breadth of concern, one cannot wonder, for its general acceptance would, so far as one can see, be an international disaster. The assumption behind the old league and the new United Nations was that there is such a thing as right and wrong in the conduct of a nation, a right and wrong that do not depend on how it happens to feel at the time. It is implied, for example, that when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, she might be wrong, and that by discussion and argument, she might be shown to be wrong. It was implied that when the Nazis invaded Poland, they might be wrong, even though German public sentiment overwhelmingly approved it. On the theory before us, it would be meaningless to call these nations mistaken if they felt approval for what they did. Then it was right, with as complete a justification as could be supplied for the disapproval felt by the rest of the world. In the present dispute between Russia and our own country over Southeast Europe, it is nonsense to speak of the right or rational course for either of us to take. If, with all the facts before the two parties, each feels approval for his own course, both attitudes are equally justified or unjustified. Neither is mistaken. There is no common reason to which they can take an appeal. There are no principles by which an international court could pronounce on the matter, nor would there be any obligation to obey the pronouncement if it were made. This cuts the ground from under any attempt to establish one's case as right or anyone else's case as wrong. So if our friends, the subjectivists, still hold their theory after I have applied my little ruler to their knuckles, which of course they will, I have but one request to make of them. Do keep it from Mr. Molotov and Mr. Vyshinsky. Okay, we've read a lot of different essays. That was fun, right? That was pretty fun. We've read a lot of different essays from different contributors to the philosophical conversation in different areas. And some of them have been very stoically logical and objective. And I'm going to give an argument and not put a lot of anything else in it. And some of them have been real characters. They've been, throwing in obvious sarcasm and cynicism and some snark and maybe some serious and genuinely felt political feelings and consequences, and appealed to ethos as well as trying to make a good argument. We've seen more and less interesting people on that spectrum. We've never found we found plenty of arguments we don't like, and we've even found some of that other quality that we might, be disinclined to accept. But all of that's acceptable, right? All of that is still a part. As long as you're engaging in the argument, you don't lose points. You don't lose necessary points by being a character. And in any case, well, we've also read works of fiction that are quite philosophically significant. So obviously there's a whole breadth here of what we're taking tastes of that apply. But it's pleasant to read someone who feels like a human being. And, various people respond differently. Some people say, well, I got distracted by that, and so I couldn't see the point, or I suspect it's not so good, or something like that. But other people will say, yeah, finally, somebody who knows that we're talking about something important and has some feeling involved. And in any case, so let's pause there. And that was a shorter essay. We've been doing some really long sessions lately, which has been fun. But so Savad, I think you've got good reason to think that nonsense was made of emotivism right there. But, the author also notices that he doesn't think he just got the last word. He's sure that the others will come back and keep believing what they believe. And he even hinted once or maybe even twice that, some of his arguments weren't really total knockdowns, that maybe you could continue to believe the other side of things. I would say he definitely had a few arguments that really do need to be answered by the emotivists. I mean, he's saying it. I think he's saying some of these things that we say shouldn't even be sayable or thinkable if what you're saying is correct. And so those are challenges for sure. You could imagine with a few of his arguments that an emotivist would just swallow it whole and say, yeah, no, that's what I mean. It's all subjective. There is no actual right and wrong. And this is going to set the stage pretty well for, well, actually, I don't know what we're going to be reading next, but there are other views that take this crisis moment here of that situation and say, well, maybe we can say it's just people trying to get other people to feel the way they do, but it might not just be emotion. It could be, if it's not objective argument and it's not just emotion, maybe we'll call it discourse. Maybe we'll say we communicate with one another to see if we can get each other in line for a common aim or something. it's hard to see if that's all there is to ethics, why that would necessarily be good or not, obviously. So there's lots of moves for people to make on both sides here, but I think I agree with you. He made nonsense of emotivism as we've seen so far. Anybody else have any reflections? Or Savad, do you have anything else to say that you want to add to that? What you said earlier. Elena, Mark, do either of you feel like emotivism is still standing after that 5 swings of the hammer from the last essay there?
I think there's some, points we can relate to as we did in some of the other essays, but I think overall it's a very naive and immature way to go about things.
It doesn't seem like it would be a very practical thing.
Right. Right. It's, you're right. It feels really good to me that I did this, so this must be the right thing, and I'm gonna just constant confirmation bias on something that could be completely destructive.
Right. Now, when the emotivist is saying that, he's not saying it's actually right because I feel good about it. He's saying the only thing we ever mean by right is I happen to feel good about it. So Blanchard is taking that. It's like, oh yeah, that's all it means, is that I happen to feel good about it. Okay. And you're right. There's a pragmatic problem here, right? But also there's an observable language problem, right? He's saying, well, then how are we talking in all these ways that don't make any sense at all if what you're saying is correct? It's not only that they don't make sense that they could even be thought by us if what you're saying is correct. I want to feel differently than I feel. I feel bad about your feeling good. When I felt good about it, I was wrong. I was wrong to feel bad about it because what happened didn't happen the way I thought it was. None of those things seem to be even comprehensible if all I'm saying is I'm having a feeling, but I'm not even saying that much. I'm just having a feeling. But so when he says that, he's saying, so the only right that there is just emotion. So maybe he's doing something illicit because he's trying to interpret what they're saying as what my feeling good about it makes it right. But what they're saying is, no, your feeling good about it is all you meant when you said it was right. You didn't even mean that. You just were feeling it. So I don't mean it's right because you feel good about it. I mean, there's no such thing as something being right. Again,
it's just all within the feeling.
It's just feeling.
Right,
it's just feeling. It's getting hot in here. It's just feeling. So I think he's made some really good arguments, but I also think, okay, I like your approach of saying, okay, practically, what does that do? Not just to our conversation, but is it even livable to think that that's the case? Now, somebody could say it's not, but I don't care. I'm a philosopher. I want to know what's true. And what's true is that we're all going to have to perish because there is no such thing as right and wrong. And so, so much the worse for our species, and we'll never go forward that way. But I think that's true, and I have a solid argument for it. But Blanchard's saying you don't have a solid argument. You have a discussion about the conversation of good and bad that doesn't even take into account 9/10 of what that conversation is and couldn't. So that's not a good argument.
Right, from the emotivist side of saying, well, yeah, just because it's just feeling.
If it's just feeling, how can I have a feeling that I'm wrong about my feeling? What? Like how can I feel like I'm doing the best thing, but I wonder if I really am? Okay. If I think it's the best thing, that's the feeling I'm having. Where's the feeling of maybe it's not? How can that be held? How can that be a feeling at the same time as I think I'm doing the best thing possible? I certainly can think I'm doing the best thing possible, but then still have a doubt and say, maybe I'm making a mistake and that would be bad. I should be careful. But that's if that ethical conversation is about something. If it's not about something, if it's just feeling, I can never be wrong. but I can never make progress.
Right. Because it's never outside the present moment. You're just talking about feeling, right?
Yeah.
You're
I have
you're
a feeling.
you're stuck in now, and there's nothing to do with a minute from now, 10 minutes from now.
Yeah. And Elena brought up a really she made an insightful connection between an essay that we read in the Philosophy of Mind intro yesterday of David Hume's attempt. Remember when David Hume sort of changed his mind halfway through the essay and realized that what he was saying didn't make sense, but that he couldn't see a way out of it anyway? He was arguing that there's no such thing as substance or self, and it's all illusory and everything. The very arguments he was making, he looked back on them and he goes, well, wait a minute, I can't even make sense of this because some of what I'm saying depends on. A lot is disappearing for these subjectivist ethicists, and a lot was disappearing for David Hume. And it's nice to have this guy come in and just make fun of it a little bit. It's almost like somebody from outside Plato's cave came into the inner sanctum where they're staring at the shadows so much that they think the shadows are more real than they are, and it's all that's real, and just dancing around them and making fun of them for being so wrong.
Yeah.
It's an interesting idea. Sorry, 1 second. Good boy. There we go. Got a little hot in here. Bad planning. Okay, Elena, Mark. Mark's probably asleep. He's got a little kid, and we do this quite late at night. All right, let's wrap it up and go into the after conversation. We'll end the stream and we'll talk about this some more.